Good evening and welcome to Chatham House, to this panel discussion on the role of experts in an age of populism. I'm sure it's a topic close to the hearts of most of you here, maybe even close to the wallets too. I'll introduce myself. I am Alan Philps. I edit the World Today magazine at Chatham House. You can see copies there. We have lots of free gifts for you here this evening because this meeting is organized in conjunction with Foreign Affairs magazine. You can pick up some copies there. And we also have Justin, who is the managing editor of Foreign Affairs. A few pieces of housekeeping. This is on the record. It is also being live streamed. So when we get to the Q&A, it's important that you speak to a microphone so that everyone can hear. I think that's all I have. Oh, could you kindly put your phones on silent mode? And if you want to tweet, which you are heartily encouraged to do, you will see a hashtag on the screens either side of us. So we're very fortunate to have an accredited expert on expertise. Professor Tom Nichols, author of The Death of Expertise. In his day job, he is a professor at the US Naval War College. Next to him is Dr. Will Davies, a reader in politics and international relations at Goldsmiths, University of London. Next to him, Julian Vogt, managing editor of Foreign Affairs, whose product you can see down there. And at the end, Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, Associate Fellow of the US and Americas Program at Chatham House. What we're going to do is I will ask each of the panel members to speak for 6 or 7 minutes. Then we will talk amongst ourselves for a little bit, and there'll be a good half an hour for questions from the floor. So, Tom, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be with you. Since we're on the record, let me start by saying I do not reflect in any way the views of the United States government, the US Navy, Harvard Extension School, my cat, anybody but me. The question, I think, posed by the title of the meeting tonight, Experts in an Age of Populism, is whether these two things can coexist, whether expertise and populism can coexist. And I think it's, in some ways, it seems like an obvious question. Of course it can. You know, the world's lived through populist phases before, and yet people trust experts from airline pilots to their doctors. What's different is, I think, the amount of interaction now between experts and the public, the amount of information available to the public, not always good, a false, or I shouldn't say false, a radical reimagining of democracy that actually was first, as I point out in the book, was first proposed by none other than C.S. Lewis, who said that democracy is becoming reinterpreted by the average person, the average citizen, not just to mean a system of political equality, but a situation of actual equality. Mm-hmm. That we are not just all politically equal, or equal in the eyes of God, or equal before the law. We're actually equal to each other. We are equally smart. We are equally intelligent or capable. And this led, as we were discussing just before we came down, this led to some interesting research on things that didn't used to have a name. Why is it that your annoying uncle, who knows nothing, is the one who holds forth with such energy? Well, it has a title now. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, in which the least capable people believe themselves to be the most capable at something. This is the way I always describe it. It's your friend who steps off the karaoke stage after tormenting everybody. He's terrible, and he looks at you and he says, "Nailed it." And everybody's just shaking their head. No, you didn't. So the other word that I use in the book that I think gets under people's skin, but I keep putting it out there because I think this is an aspect of populism. I've talked a lot about expertise, and I think I'm glad tonight we're going to be talking about populism as well, is narcissism. I think that this increasingly global phenomenon of, at least in the developed world. Perhaps it's an outcome of affluence or higher education levels, or the spread of education leading to what I call an illusion of knowledge, is leading to an increased narcissism, that we spend a lot of time alone, we spend it in front of the computer, we believe that every opinion we have has to be expressed. I say this as someone who spends a lot of hours on Twitter, so I'm guilty too. Everybody who follows me knows that I'm a complete maniac for wine gums now that I'm here in London, because I felt it important to share that with the world, because people need to know what kind of candy I like. But what I found interesting about this is that I thought, when I started writing this, that this was primarily an American problem. That Americans, are always, everything we have to say is most important, and we talk, and we have to tell people what's what. I just found out today that the book is going into its 11th foreign language translation. So clearly, it's from Asia to Europe. The most recent one is going to be in Ukrainian. And so it's clearly a problem that other people think exists in their societies. And I think in part that is because of the internet, which is reaching everywhere. I was speaking on, doing a speaking tour for the State Department in the Czech Republic in October. And all of the problems that we'll probably end up talking about tonight were just replicated right before my eyes in Pilsen and Ostrava and everywhere I went. So some of that's the internet, but I'll just close by saying I think it would be a mistake for us to lay this off on technology. I think that there is something else going on. I think this predated the advent of technology. I talk a lot in the book about education. I think there's something wrong. Certainly, and I'll say this only regarding the American system, I think that we have embraced a therapeutic model of education that asks students how they feel instead of what they're learning. I think that our media has become dysfunctional, in part because there's so much of it. I often refer to the media as being something like our diet, that we've never had so much food in the world. We've never had such plenty, which is why we're all fat and diabetic and unhealthy, because we're gorging on the bad stuff. So I think that this has been something that has been brewing for a good 30 or 40 years. I think technology has kind of put it on steroids, but we can talk about it more. In foreign policy in particular, I don't know how we're going to square this circle, because foreign policy and populism, to some extent, cannot coexist. And I'll leave that as my last statement.
Okay, thank you very much. So you can't blame it all on technology. Will,
great. Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here this evening. I want to make a couple of points briefly. One about where I think there isn't a problem with experts in relation to populism, and one where I think there definitely is. And as far as where there isn't a problem, you'll often read that there is a crisis of trust in Western democracies, that populists will say that the elites are, hypocrites, that they are serving themselves, and so on. But if you look at a lot of the surveys that are done by the likes of Pew and Edelman and this sort of thing on levels of trust across society, across the world, in fact, the area where there is a serious crisis of trust today is the media. This is where rates of trust in facts and truth have been falling steadily for decades. And of course, where experts are dependent on the media for the dissemination of their knowledge, people inevitably have difficulty in distinguishing that which they consider to be true from that which they consider to be false. Trust in the media also correlates quite closely to sympathy for populist movement. In America, 61% of Trump voters do not trust the media. 27% of Clinton voters in 2016 do trust the media. So the distrust in the media and populism have a very close correlation, which doesn't actually exist where it comes to experts to the same extent. And a lot of the Pew data shows that trust in scientists, the scientific establishment in the United States, has stayed relatively steady over the last 40 years. At around about 40% of people in society trust the scientific establishment. It's remained relatively level since the early 1970s. The other area where there is clearly a problem of trust is in representative democracy. We know that politicians are held in lower and lower esteem, and to the extent that politicians get involved with experts, and to the extent that experts become politicians like Macron or Ed Miliband or these sorts of figures, there will inevitably be a kind of fallout effect on the centers of expertise and on the notion of technocrats, to the extent that technocrats are seen as a kind of fusion of political and scientific authority. And there is tremendous resentment towards the European Union across Europe, not just in the UK. It is, fans the flames of populism in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere. And that derives from a sense that technocrats working for an unelected government are combining forms of kind of scientific authority with forms of political privilege. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that people don't trust the facts that experts are producing. In Britain, most people, about 80% of people, trust the Office of National Statistics, but a small minority of people trust politicians who actually use their statistics correctly. So we need to distinguish between trusting the actual experts and the facts, and trusting the ways in which those kinds of facts are disseminated in society. Where I think we have had a severe problem over the last decade, and which has contributed directly to the rise of populism, is in relation to economic expertise and economic technocracy. And since the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9, there have been various drastic failures of regulation, of calculation, of prediction that have led, every time a politician or any kind of public figure stands up and cites economic facts or figures or data, they are considered almost in principle to be telling lies by a large section of society. And this isn't simply because that section of society is ignorant, it's for good reasons that have developed over the last 10 years. And I just want to list three of those very briefly. The first is the financial crisis itself. This was an epic failure of expertise both by central banks, by financial regulators, by credit rating agencies, by market analysts working inside investment banks, extremely clever, extremely well-educated, extremely well-paid people who started to treat risks as if they were facts and had a complete kind of failure of basic philosophical understanding of what they were doing, which Alan Greenspan eventually admitted after the financial crisis that there'd been a kind of fundamental flaw in the whole ideology of the whole thing. And this led to a kind of meltdown in the governing economic philosophy of the times. Secondly, austerity. George Osborne spent around 6 years saying that cutting public spending would lead to economic growth. None of the economic establishment agreed with that. This is not an ideological point I'm making. There is barely any economist you can find in the world who believes that cutting public spending is a way of growing the economy. There are a few rare examples, and there was one paper that the Treasury based its whole vision of austerity on, which was the famous Reinhardt and Rogoff paper showing that if public debt reached a certain level of GDP, that it would lead to a recession. That paper, as you probably recall, was found to have a basic spreadsheet error in it, leading to the calculations of that paper not actually being valid. George Osborne, in my view, was the original post-truth politician in this country. He said various things about economic policy that turned out to be false. And there were actually, and this is something that people from across the London School of Economics, across the political spectrum believe. And the authority of economic credibility in today's world is, in my view, rightly held in some suspicion. And I want to end back on the topic of populism, because we've now had Brexit, which was in many ways sticking two fingers up at economic rationality, at economic experts, and so on. The famous Michael Gove comment about these people, I think people in this country have had enough of experts. Let me just remind you what the Treasury published. This was the Treasury. This wasn't Vote Leave. This wasn't Leave.eu. This wasn't Farage. This wasn't even George Osborne or the Conservative Party. The Treasury officials published a document saying, this was before the referendum, a vote to leave would cause an immediate and profound economic shock, creating instability and uncertainty which would be compounded by the complex and interdependent negotiations that would follow. The central conclusion is that the effect of this profound shock would be to push the UK into recession and lead to a sharp rise in unemployment. Now, that was a prediction, so of course it can be false. All predictions can be false. But when people from the Brexit side of the debate said that this is Project Fear, I think we have to recognise that they were actually onto something, and that this was an attempt to try and bully people with economic expertise. And I think we can't be surprised if people don't fall for the same trick again. And I know that there are these Brexit models coming out soon, but I think that they won't have the impact that we think they might.
All right, thank you very much. So Gove was right, I was saying, because he did actually, when he was talking about experts, he was talking about experts with acronyms, which is basically the OECD, IMF, and other people. Yes.
So I'm a bit of an outlier in this group of experts talking about expertise. I am the only non-expert on the panel. I don't.
Me too.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. We're both outliers.
I'm a jack of all trades.
There you go. I don't have a PhD. I've never worked in government at a high level. I'm a journalist. I'm an editor. So what I bring to this conversation, though, is that at Foreign Affairs, we publish, sort of the kind of people that you see quoted in newspapers and other magazines. These are top-level scholars and current or former government officials, think tank wonks, experts, the kind of people we're talking about now. And what I do all day, essentially, is help them try to communicate in a clear and compelling way to people like me, the non-expert audience. And so, that's the background I sort of bring to this. And what I'll say is, what you learn when you do that are what you might consider some of the supply side problems with this issue of expertise and populism. We've been talking about what I would call the demand side, the problems with society, the problems with the audience for expert opinion analysis. What I tend to see is the problems with the supply, the problems that experts themselves actually inject. And I'll tell you what my sort of theory of this, and it's informed by my experience at Foreign Affairs. In earlier eras, experts didn't necessarily have direct access to a mass audience. With mass education and digital technologies, that has changed, and it's mostly a good thing. However, the rhetoric of expertise hasn't really kept pace. It hasn't adapted in the ways in which it should have. In earlier eras, you had experts who wrote books and scholarly articles, but they didn't write op-eds. Economists and political scientists, didn't blog. They certainly didn't tweet. And this is a different world we're in now. The reason, what I see in a lot of the product of experts that causes problems that may contribute to the falling trust are two very perverse incentives. The first has to do with a perverse incentive that exists for policy professionals when they write. This are people who are in government, who are sort of around government, who are in think tanks. They have a perverse incentive towards vagueness. And the second perverse incentive is a perverse incentive that exists for academics who are incentivized to be jargony. And let me talk about the first one. Vagueness, if you are a person whose job it is to inform a policymaker, you have a good reason to get very good at communicating in a strategically vague way, because that politician or that official may have to compromise. She may have to shift her position, actually. And so you're going to get very good at crafting language that is sufficiently vague that it can be adapted for whatever shift happens. So we end up, when we edit folks like this, we end up having to push them a lot on this vagueness. We have to pin them down. So for example, we'll get a sentence like, well, the Trump administration should engage with China on climate change. And you say, well, what does that mean? What is engage? Engage could mean any number of things. Or, countering violent, we have to counter violent extremism online. Well, okay, who has to do that? Who has to do this countering? You try to pin people down, and they tend to resist. Academics, it's a different incentive. It's this jargon issue, and here, look, jargon has always existed, and sometimes jargon is justified, especially in hard sciences where there's highly technical stuff that there's just no plain English equivalent for. With social scientists, with historians, political scientists, economists, they don't quite have that excuse, and instead what I see is a different incentive at work. The fact is that a lot of times social science insights are actually commonsensical. And I don't mean to detract from them. I'm not saying that they are somehow shallow or thin and that the people who have them are not shedding a lot of light. They're incredibly useful. But oftentimes they are insights that non-experts could in fact arrive at themselves and often do. Take deterrence, for example, right? Deterrence is a very important concept in political science and in international relations. Most people intuitively understand deterrence. Most people intuitively understand that a threat, if you're threatening someone, the effectiveness of that threat depends on your credibility. Anyone with young children knows that. And so the difference is that when an expert applies that concept or explores it in depth, she is bringing to that her deep background in the history of this concept and all the different ramifications of it, and the social scientific methodology, which non-experts do not know how to do and do not apply consistently. The problem is it's hard to signal in plain English that all of that is happening. It used to be that the byline would be enough. You know, so-and-so is the professor at elite institution, so-and-so is the assistant secretary of whatever, and you know, so-and-so is being published by Foreign Affairs. Well, that must mean that she or he really knows what they're talking about. Increasingly, that's not the case because people come to the table with a reduced trust. That has only increased the incentive to use jargon to signal to readers, this is really complicated and very complex, and only someone who's really an expert can understand it. People hate it when we strip that stuff out of their articles because they say, oh, you're taking all the nuance out, you're taking all the complexity out. When really what they sort of mean is, now I just sound like an ordinary person. And now this is just so, it's too clear. You know, I need to complicate this somehow to signal that it's really important and interesting. So, you know, we try to strike this balance, and I'm speaking for myself, you know, at Foreign Affairs, but people at all different publications do this, and we try to strike this balance between, you know, preserving the complexity, honoring the fact that people are really dealing with high-level stuff, while also making them abandon these perverse incentives towards vagueness and jargon, and with the hope that we're contributing in some way to kind of communication that maybe won't reverse declining trust in you know, figures of authority or authoritative expertise, but might at least stanch the bleeding.
Thank you very much for explaining those perverse incentives which make people write incomprehensibly. Leslie.
Okay, so now I've changed everything I'm going to say. As an academic slash think tanker, I guess I could put myself in that category. No, I found your comments actually very interesting, but I do have to respond a little bit. I agree that there is this problem of expertise, and there's clearly an incentive within the academy to create disciplinary boundaries, to professionalize, in part to keep people out and to differentiate yourself from the ordinary public, or indeed from other academics and other disciplines for a whole variety of career reasons. Those incentives have gotten higher and created more professionalization and more jargon. But I think I have to come back to the deterrence example. Not everything's entirely intuitive, and sometimes things that the public might take to be intuitive actually are not intuitive. For example, deterrence is not necessarily intuitive. If you threaten somebody, there's a very significant debate about whether that leads to more aggression, more arms buildups, and all sorts of very negative competitive dynamics that can lead you into spirals that nobody wants to see, as opposed to creating the kind of peace and stability that one might hope for. So I think there are very significant debates. And the problem is the jargon, but one doesn't want to underestimate the very important significance of the social science methodology, which has to do with rigorous, qualitative, and sometimes quantitative empirical testing of these supposedly obvious and simplistic findings that social scientists engage in that is somehow different from hard science. In fact, the difference between hard science and social science is something that a lot of people challenge. And in fact, if you think that the methodology is similar across, then I think we should be careful about privileging expertise in the hard sciences and taking that privilege away from expertise and the importance of it in the social sciences. So I would really very seriously critique that argument. Nonetheless, the jargon is a problem. Let me say something really quickly about expertise and about how I think the marketplace matters on, and it goes to the social media and the changes in technology, which I do think are actually very significant. And I know you do, but I know you think it's deeper. But just to sort of put that out there. In 1992, to cite some experts, Page and Shapiro wrote a book one is a Columbia University scholar, I'm not sure where the other is, called The Rational Public. And they found that American public opinion was more likely to be swayed by media testimony delivered by experts that were credible and biased. And this was a very significant statistical finding. So if indeed we have moved to an era where experts and expertise is not valued, and like the previous speaker, I'm not sure that we actually know that that's the case. But we have an intuition that it's the case, but I don't think we actually know if that's the case, and I am somewhat skeptical. It is, if you buy the findings of, at least in the US context, of this very rigorous research that was done of public opinion attitudes, it's a very dramatic, significant, and highly consequential shift. Having said that, I'm not persuaded that the shift is necessarily there, but I think one thing that really is important is differentiating it, and you did that in part across sectors. I think it's also important to differentiate whether or not expertise is being rejected at the level of fact, data, how many people were there at the march, how many people were there for the inauguration, or whether it's being debated at the level of causality. What is it that produces a better economic result? What kind of economic policy leads to greater distribution of benefits, trickle down versus intervention? That's a very different kind of challenge to expertise, and I think that clearly the challenge to facts is deeply problematic. The challenge to the debate over causality that expertise engage in is also problematic, and then to add a layer to that, one concern is are established consensus views amongst experts being challenged, or is the challenge coming in those domains where experts themselves disagree very dramatically? And one could argue that the higher stakes problem is when the challenges to expertise that has been debated on issues of causality, think about climate change, where experts themselves really very much agree. North Korea, I think, is another example on the merits of a preemptive strike, where there really is consensus among the experts, but we get that expertise being challenged frequently by elites, right? Not only by the public. So I think we need to really disaggregate what's being challenged and evaluate the consequences of that. A word on the marketplace, because I think it actually really is important. You know, the idea of liberal theory, the liberals believe that, you know, if you let in this realm of ideas and expertise and facts, if you open up the marketplace and you subject all ideas to, you know, freedom of the marketplace, that the better ideas will win out. My PhD advisor and dear friend and colleague, Jack Snyder, wrote a lot on why this doesn't work out very well in in states that are transitioning from authoritarianism to democracy, that elites actually use the opening up of the marketplace of idea to whip up nationalism in a very problematic way. And I think that some of the arguments in that work that he did with Karen Ballantyne in the 1990s during the wars in the Balkans are things that are really relevant to today. And in particular, they talk about, you know, the segmentation and the fragmentation of the market. And the problem, of course, for populist appeals is that when you have a changing media landscape where there are multiple views expressed by elites through multiple challenges, that's all fine. But if the other side of that needs to be that the recipients of that information are being exposed to diverse views. And to the extent that what we're seeing is the recipients engaging with the media through echo chambers, what we talk about as echo chambers, through silos, so they're not actually being exposed to that diverse array of views, I think we land in a very, very difficult position. And then finally, I wanted to say one word about this whole debate about emotion and the need for dispassionate analysis. And I'm not really sure where I come down on this, but I think it's a really critical point, because what we continue to hear is that, you know, we need to move towards expertise and move away from emotional arguments. And I fear that if the issue is less populism and more nativism, I'm not persuaded that we can win the argument by detaching the integration of not emotionalism, but emotion and values from rational arguments. If we really differentiate, if we continue to think that rationality is something entirely different from emotion and values, I think we're inevitably going to continue to win the debate if it's really much more about nativism than simply populism. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. This is a complicated issue. Well, I'm going to start by asking quite a simple question. for each of the panel members to answer was, is it true that government has got so complex, the machinery of government has got so complex, and that it requires a technocracy, and inevitably, with this complexity, the technocracy is not going to be able to speak to the people as, say, politicians did a century ago? Is there any way that we can get around the gulf which exists between the ordinary people and the experts who are unfortunately necessary?
The word we're avoiding here, and Leslie alluded to it a moment ago, is elite.
Elite,
and
yes.
one of my pet peeves, and anybody who follows me on Twitter knows I have many of them, but one of my people say, well, you experts and elites, as though we are the same people all the time. And it's simply not true. I worked for a U.S.
You are an intellectual elite.
Well, okay, but yes. I worked for a U.S. senator. I knew which one of us had the vote.
Right.
I knew which one of us went to lunch with the president, and it wasn't me. And I think that this question of technocracy raises a larger question, because it's interesting. When we have a gathering like this, the tendency is for experts and intellectual elites to kind of hair-shirt it a bit, to say, what are we doing wrong? How is it that we're not communicating? Why does the public not trust us? What are the mistakes we've made? When I was writing the book, I got the financial crisis, the Iraq War, Vietnam, thalidomide, Challenger, one after another. And in the book, the thing I did that I think is a little more controversial, perhaps because of my own background, I don't come from a particularly privileged background by American standards, is that I start to lay quite a lot of blame for this situation on the public. When the financial crisis, why were there no bad financial instruments earlier, in the 1970s? Because there weren't any bad mortgages, because the banks wouldn't write them, because the government wouldn't allow them to. What triggered the financial crisis? No matter how you slice it, it was a lot of people buying houses they couldn't afford, and buying a lot of houses they couldn't afford. And people don't want to hear this. The Iraq War. You experts told us. No, we didn't. 100 experts took a full-page ad in the New York Times saying this is a bad idea, and the public said, shut up, pinheads. And it's okay. Now, experts make mistakes all the time, but I think we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what we're doing wrong and not thinking about the public holding up its end of the bargain. And that's where we come back to technocracy. Because then the answer really, when it's just, look, shut up and protect me from myself, then there are always going to be plenty of people who say, okay, I can do that. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the classic paranoid 1975 thriller, 3 Days of the Condor.
Anyone seen it?
I make my students watch, and at the end, a great CIA conspiracy is outed at the end of it. There, I spoiled it for you. But at the end of it, this very cynical CIA officer confronts the hero, and he says, look, today it's food, tomorrow it's plutonium, after that it's water or oil. He says, what do you think people are going to want us to do about that? And the hero says, ask them. And he says, no, not now, then. And he says, when their cars won't start, and they're cold, and people have never known hungry are starting to go hungry, he says, they're just going to want us to get it for them. And it's probably one of the most cynical, terrifying lines in a movie. He said, they're not going to want us to ask them. They're going to want us to just get it for them. And I'm desperately hoping that we can stave off that kind of outcome, because this current situation is unsustainable. It is virtually unsustainable to tell experts, you must be right all the time, and you must provide this magnificent standard of living, and we really don't want to know how it's done. It's magic.
So you're saying the ordinary people have to take their share of the blame?
Or we're going to drift into technocracy, because that's where we're headed already.
What do you think of technocracy?
Well, in answer to your original question, I mean, clearly modern societies over the last 150 years or so have required more and more and more complex forms of coordination, bureaucracy, centralization of administrative powers, and so on. I mean, the rise of the railways and so on. I mean, the need for concentrations of decision-making power using sophisticated forms of calculation has been driving this for a long time, and it's provoked particularly in American political science, a huge level of anxiety around how does this combine with notions of democracy and so on. And there are all sorts of theories to do with, how to combine deliberation with technocratic solutions and this sort of thing. I think that I suppose that part of the problem is where technocrats and elected figures start to blur into one. And I think that's probably the perception, at any rate, that has started to fuel a lot of populism. It was certainly a problem in Britain in relation to New Labour, and a lot of the animosity that New Labour attracted was the sense that here was a political party led by former policy advisors, speechwriters, civil servants, think tankers, special advisors.
We're talking
and so on.
David Miliband here.
Yeah,
right?
David Cameron was a former worked in Norman Lamont's office and this sort of thing. So there is a kind of this revolving door between the bureaucratic wing of the state and the supposedly representative wing of the state. And I don't see any real viable alternative to having bureaucratic instruments at the disposal of the state if you're going to do things like tax collection and have a welfare state and have an army and have an NHS and so on. There is not a sort of purely deliberative way of running all of those things without reversing about sort of 200 years of progress. But I think that what has fueled populism is the sense, and of course I'm not letting populists off the hook, I hope, but the sense that people now are all the same, which is in a way that term elite is often used in a kind of pejorative sense, which is, oh, there's a bunch of people in London, Brussels, Washington, DC, and they all know each other, and they're all in league with each other, and they're all very clever, they went to the same universities. That's the populist kind of vision, and I think that what needs expressing, both in defense of democracy and in defense of technocracy, is how the two things are different. And I think that's partly what in some ways, if populism can force that upon us, then it will actually have some positive effects, potentially.
Jump in on what Thomas said.
Oh, I did. I'm first. Did you say you published the experts published in the New York Times, and the people didn't listen? Was that what
There was
you said?
a full-page ad of international relations professors in the Times.
In the New York Times. So okay, in the New York Times. It's not where you publish if you're trying to have a broad public impact across a very large audience. So I don't think that you can dismiss the public because they didn't listen to an ad in the New York Times. And I know many of the people who signed it and dearly respect them. So I take issue with the environment analogy too. All people discount the future. If you put two products side by side and one costs double the amount of the other one, and your pocketbook is constrained, and somebody says in 20 years, it's a privilege to be able to make the long-term choice. So there's a market here which I think we cannot underestimate. And I think if you put two products side by side and you said, if you buy this one in 20 years, your grandchildren are going to be in a better place, and it costs basically the same, or maybe it's 5% more, you're going to get a different outcome. So I'd be very skeptical of blaming it on the public and not looking at the social context, the social structure, and the market incentives.
You say the market incentives, you mean we're talking about people who are at the struggling end of the scale?
Struggling. I mean, struggling, the middle, right? The middle working class, which is where the bulk of the population rests.
Market incentives, I call the inability to defer gratification. One of the problems, for example, Americans rail about, I've had this argument for 25 years, we don't make color televisions in America anymore. Well, if you didn't want 2 or 3 of them at affordable prices, Americans are awash in a remarkably high standard of electronic living, fueled totally by cheap overseas labor. Americans won't pay what it costs to buy an American-made television set, because then you're going to have one of them. And so there is I'm not, we may be talking past each other, because you may be talking about people at a very, hard edge of subsistence. I'm talking about the average kind of lower middle class to middle class consumer who says, I want a bigger house. I want a better car. I want 2 televisions. I want 3 laptops in my house. I want Wi-Fi, and that, I think that level, and all of this, by the way, happens by magic. I mean, if you ask people how this happens, it's just, that the idea that experts are involved, including not just STEM experts, because I think you're right about privileging that knowledge, which is madness. But to say just to use the internet requires diplomats and conventions and physical security and various kinds. People just don't want to hear that.
So you're expecting everyone to understand everything about what they do? what brings them their lifestyle.
I think that's unfair.
It sounds like it.
Objection. But I think this notion of I've had this argument with friends who when I was a young kid. I come from a dying, or not dying, dead in some ways, factory town. I mean, I grew up with empty factories around me and smokestacks that don't make smoke anymore. And it was amazing to hear people say, as they were mounting their second Chinese-made television, to say, we got to bring jobs back to America. Well, there's a kind of reflectiveness there that used to drive me up the wall and I would have these arguments and don't have two televisions. So I take your point that for the problem of the future, that is a privileged decision to be able to make. But this is not impossible for the public. We talk about the public as if they're completely incapable of reasoning this way.
Very good. Should we open up questions to the floor? Well, let me start. I'll start on the front, which I shouldn't do, over there. Could you announce who you are?
My name's James Bowen. I'm a journalist and author, an occasional expert at different times in my life on different subjects.
Very good.
First, I'd like to challenge quickly the revisionist history of Iraq. I mean, the experts in Iraq weren't the people who put an ad in the New York Times. The experts were the people who decided whether or not Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And in that case, they were clearly wrong. So I think that's another thing that can be added to the financial crisis. I'd like to respond to your question about narcissism, which is a good point, but isn't narcissism, the culture of narcissism, which was really identified back in the 70s, just an aspect of consumerism, capitalism, where the customer is king and everybody caters to the gratification of the consumer, and to the extent that it spread beyond America, maybe that's just a reflection of consumerism spreading beyond America?
Narcissism, would you like to respond?
Just a quick answer on narcissism. I'm not quite sure. I think some of it, if you had asked my father, who 2 days ago would have been 100 years old. So there's a big generational span there. My dad used to say it came about because of affluence, that increasingly people were more and more disconnected from the things that made their lives good, including things like security. I mean, the idea of serving in the military, that there are duties that come with all of this, and that instead we self-actualize. We go to college because it's fun, and because we enjoy it, and not because we're sort of investing, in the future. And we just do a lot of things that come easier and easier and easier. I mean, when people ask me what my childhood was like in the 1960s, they think of it as very idealized. And I always say, you know what I remember about the 1960s? No air conditioning. That's what I remember. And so I think a lot of this affluence happens almost transparently to people that they take for granted, and it gives them the leisure to focus more and more. And our culture, I think, says it's about you, it's about your happiness, it's about your self-esteem. And that's pervaded throughout our society at this point.
Okay. Are we getting away from experts? You had a question, sir. Yes. Will you wait for the microphone? No, I was this gentleman in the front row. You'll come later. Yeah.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute, one guy that had his acronyms cut out. I just want to bring back to the question that was asked by Professor Nichols and by you on the technology and how much the technology had an impact on this. Now, you, Professor Nichols, tended to sort of not dismiss, but not discount it up to a certain point. But there were some areas where I looked where big crises, for instance, the whole subject of GM food and the subject of mad cow disease, both the disease and the number of casualties that it was supposed to have, which it didn't, where a lot of the pressure actually came from quite uninformed reporting, the barrage of uninformed reporting that at the end sort of erased any distinction between expertise and non-expertise, or the reporting of medical discoveries in the media, which is very often rushed out, half-baked, by newspapers which no longer have the money to have a science correspondent. So I just wonder how much the technology platforms have sort of evened out the distinction between expertise and non-expertise, and in a way battered down that distinction to pulverize it.
Who would like to? You'd like to?
Leslie, did you want to?
I mean, I think it's, I haven't done, there are a lot of people that are doing very serious work on this, and I'm not one of them. But my reaction would be that it's tremendous, that your instinct is right, that the proliferation of news media, somebody quoted at a conference in New York about a year ago that about 20 years ago, 70% of American college students got their news information from 3 sources in combination. 70% of news was from BBC, New York Times, and Washington Post, and now it's less than 20%. So just the fact that people are getting their information from other places, right? The fragmentation of the market, and the fact that so many of the places where we're getting our news do not have editors. So they're not fact-checked. The fact that the New York Times fact-checks is wonderful, but it fact-checks for New York Times readers.
They don't. No. Newspapers are not fact-checked.
I don't mean that. They have that separate column where they say fact-checking of, right? The New York Times runs a piece now.
They do
run
a sort of feature where they fact-check statements,
That's
but they don't fact-check their own.
No, sorry. I'm referring to the feature that they're running now where they're fact-checking public statements by people like Donald Trump. Is not helpful because they're fact-checking for the people who already don't believe the facts that are being delivered by Donald Trump, right? So you get fact-checking of external speeches to lend credibility within the silos in which they're being read. So there's not scrutiny across the echo chambers. That's the fragmentation and the fact that the readers are not subject to a free marketplace of ideas, which requires ideas to be contested in a free market space, but the market is not free, it's fragmented. So I think it's deeply problematic.
Sorry, speaking of editors, and this goes to your point, you were talking about the Edelman Trust surveys. One of the most incredible findings in that most recent survey, and one that I took sort of personally, was that amongst UK public, 59% said they were more likely to trust a search engine than a human editor. So, the reason, the lack of editors is having a sort of follow-on effect, which is that there is a lack of sort of curation. You also raised an interesting point, though, before, Leslie. You said, you don't take out an ad in the New York Times to reach people. The question is, where do you take out that ad then, and what do you, how do you?
Today, USA Today, every hotel room, right? Even the kind of motel rooms get USA Today in the front. I mean, I'm just saying there are other newspapers that if you want to reach a broader public, you could go to.
What I'm saying is that the challenge is that there aren't any single places that you can go. Those 3 news sources are, well, okay, but those are news articles. That's not actually an aggregated news source.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly fragmented. And it's hard to know. One bit of sympathy I have for people who want to take dissenting views, experts who want to, go cut against the grain, is it's very difficult for them to find those persuadables who they hope that are there.
Or maybe it's, sorry.
Well, I just wanted to make a very brief comment. I mean, before, because the internet has been in society for 20 years, social media has been around for a decade or so, but I mean, if you look at the movement that's often called junk science, which is the deliberate pushing of bogus facts into the public sphere, it's been the tobacco industry obviously did it very effectively from the 1950s onwards. The oil industry has done it since the 1970s. There's now clear evidence that Exxon knew about the risk of global warming in relation to CO2 emissions from the 1970s and were funding scientists to say the opposite. So that has been going on for some time. Now, of course, the internet creates the sense of the level playing field that you're talking about, but the idea that you can run the scientific public sphere as a kind of Darwinian conflict between different voices and that one of them will eventually rise to the top, of course, eventually you would hope that real science is the one that wins, but you can go for several years, if not decades, by sowing a lot of doubt on that. That's the broad issue that's known as agnotology that various people have written about, the deliberate manufacturing of ignorance. And now we think that the Russians started it with Twitter, but I mean this has been going on for decades.
Quick comment on the platform issue. The problem is, and I'm going to push this back onto the public again, the internet creates a shortcut to the illusion of knowledge. And this is, anybody who teaches undergraduates can tell you that if it's not immediately findable by clicking, it's not worth knowing. And so I'm not that, but that has always been a problem. The internet has put it on steroids, that you can find basically anything you already want to know by asking the your magic box.
Okay, this gentleman here, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ewan Grant, Chatham House member and former intelligence analyst. I have taught over many years professionally the President Kennedy case, so I certainly understand the professor's comment about the internet creates the illusion of knowledge, given the vast amount of rubbish that is on the internet there. My question is, I also do Challenger, by the way. My question is in relation to the professor's comment about narcissism, and I wonder if the other members of the panel would care to comment on that. In my experience, narcissism among elites is often associated with arrogance and ignorance and very serious consequences for everyone because of very bad decisions. I'm also a shareholder in Royal Bank of Scotland. Thank you.
So narcissism of elites. So we're not talking about the narcissism of the populace, but the narcissism of the elites. Yes, Lizzie.
I mean, well, first of all, I'm not an expert on narcissism, although I feel like
You're always saying you're not an expert.
I mean, but there are people who are expert on narcissists, and they tend to be in different kind of sciences. But one of the problems is that we've all become armchair experts on narcissism since Donald Trump was elected, and armchair experts on Trumpism and his psychology. But I guess I want to come back, and maybe it gets at the internet narcissist question, but two things. One is, not all graduates, I've taught in universities since 1996, and still teach, including yesterday, and I can promise you that not all graduates stop with what they can find on the internet. In fact, I would say that the vast majority, but 80 to 90%, probably 95% of my students think very hard, long beyond the internet. They do like to get access to books and articles online, but they read them, they debate them, they think very seriously. Maybe things are better in the UK than in the US, but I've taught in the US as well. So I think we have to be careful about taking our graduates and our undergraduates down further than they deserve to go. And I think actually there's a lot of hope. The other thing about the internet is that, yes, everything's on the internet, but the nice thing about our educational systems is that we're teaching people how to scrutinize and to think about what they're finding on the internet. People frequently say to me, oh, Twitter, it's such a waste of time. I know you don't think that. But the thing about Twitter is, I always say, well, what do you mean? Like, are white pieces of paper a waste of time? It's simply a vessel. It's a tool. You have to decide what's useful, who's useful to follow, when they're speaking the truth, when they're not, right? That takes a level of education and discipline, and that's what we teach our students and our peers and our colleagues. So again, I would be careful to just disregard any of these things. It is about the educational underpinnings. And so narcissism and the internet. And I guess I don't have a good way of answering the question. I feel the phenomenon.
Narcissism amongst the leadership, leaders, narcissistic leaders. That was what you were asking about.
But what is the question? There are.
Seeing a connection with arrogance and ignorance, but in an elite context, and that it tends to lead to disaster. And I've seen very obvious cases of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, should we take another question? Yes, the lady at the back, who I can barely see. Yes, stand up.
Hello, I'm Jordana Friedman. I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and also a think tank and geotype. I just two-fingered that comment because one of the big picture questions that I have is, is the populism that we're seeing, in other words, a kind of it really is about, in my opinion, non-expert elitists kind of battling it out with other elitists, aka experts, and who have perhaps just chosen the mechanism of populism. They've ridden this cycle, which is part of a historical cycle where populism comes and goes, and they're running with it. I'm just wondering, is that a paradigm that speaks to any of you, or is that, or is that a misjudgment?
Yes.
I think the point about experts bullying people with expert opinion is something I've warned experts about. That the one thing I don't talk about in the book, because I hate this subject more than any other, is climate change. because it is, I mean, there is a lot of bullying going on, because I think, climate change is real, it's happening, we have to do something about it. But I've had discussions with scientists where I keep saying over and over again, people have a right to make dumb choices, to do bad things. As I say in the book, if the people of Boston want to let the city slide into the harbor, that's a terrible choice. But you can't say, because my facts are true, you must adopt my policy proposals. There is a world of difference between those two things. Now, I think where people get frustrated, and where I get frustrated with people, is they do see these intra-elite or intra-expert battles, and they want to be involved in them, because it's kind of like during the Cold War when we used to argue about arms control. People felt, look, my life is in danger here, and I want to be a part of this. I don't want you guys just talking over my head. But I am forced to point out that as people say that, we also know that most Americans cannot name all three branches of their own government. 36% of Americans can find North Korea on a map. The rest of them think it's in Australia. I'm not kidding. We really, and the problem is that correlates really strongly. The Washington Post did a poll a few years back where the people who had the strongest opinion about the use of military force in Ukraine, believing America should intervene militarily in Ukraine, now think about that for a minute, were also the people least likely to know where it was.
That makes sense. That makes sense, right? If you see that Ukraine is as close to Russia as it is, then of course you don't think it's a good idea. But if you don't know that, then of course you think differently. I mean, I read that in your book, and I thought, well, that makes sense to me, right?
Wait,
of course.
Where's the person who says, wait a minute, I don't know where that is, I'm not going to express a strong opinion, and I'm going to find out?
You didn't give them the opportunity to answer. I mean,
yes, I think the question was more about, well, is what we're talking about, this populism, is it various elite people who are coming along and riding this populist wave? I mean, are you thinking of commodity brokers like Nigel Farage and other things like that?
Sure, opportunist, market opportunist. Tom, let me just point out one thing, though, that relates to this, is that you don't write about climate change, it bothers you. You say that you tell scientists people have the right to make bad choices, but the other half of your critique is all about how their terrible choices are ruining everything. So, those two things don't square.
I haven't given up my commitment to democracy entirely.
But let me point out, though, that with climate change, the issue, my impression is not so much that people are saying, I get it, it's totally true, and it's just awful, but I'm just going to keep, driving my gas guzzler. There really is denialism. There is a real, what you see as bullying, from my point of view, is exasperation and desperation with trying to overcome this strain of denialism that just won't budge.
There is some of that, but I think you'll also find that with a lot of programs and a lot of policy choices, people will agree with the experts right up until they're confronted with the costs of it.
Right. Yep.
And then suddenly it's, well, I don't know if that's true.
I see. So you see the causal lateral going the other way.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Who has another question? The gentleman in the glasses there.
Hi, thank you. I'm Imad Ahmed. I'm a PhD student at UCL. The panel's been discussing what platform to use to persuade and access people who might not be easy to persuade. What if you caught them off guard and appeared on their local radio stations? So you wouldn't have to venture into the bar in the town that you grew up. You wouldn't have to get a bloody nose. You have a wall of separation, and maybe it's a little bit highfalutin to assume that they're reading newspapers.
Yep. So I didn't quite get your question.
So the question is, would you consider going to the places that you grew up, if you're not from DC or London, and featuring on their local radio station?
I've done talk radio all over the United States, and American talk radio. And I've done it precisely for that reason, because I can't complain about people not hating expertise if I'm not willing to go to where the people are and talk to them. And I have been, in my career, not just since this book, but I used to write about Russia. I was a Soviet expert, which tells you that I use that word, how long ago that was. Arms control. I've given talks, all over the US, all over North America. So I believe in that, and I think experts need to do it.
Yes,
can I just add one line on that? I had an experience, I think it was yesterday, where I was on a panel and somebody from the State Department, actually it was on the record, so Heather Newart from the State Department, spokesman, right, for the State, cited a Fox News poll where Trump's popularity was very high. And so I say this because it was a panel discussion and I wasn't given space to respond to that. So one thing that I think is incredibly important, and this wasn't the local media station, this was Australian Broadcasting Corporation, you do have to have training, right? It's easy to go on CNN or BBC, but when my other example would be going on LBC where they suddenly put somebody on an American who basically said, everybody in Africa is a terrorist. And you need training, right? You need to know how to respond very quickly to things that are really beyond the pale that you don't have to respond to if you're just talking in the classroom and publishing in the New York Times and talking on CNN or BBC.
Right. So, Justin, what do you think of this? I mean, should people who contribute to your magazine, should you say, no, cut it down to 600 words and get it in USA Today? Is that what?
No, we don't think that, although it's funny you mentioned that because we did used to do exactly that. We would take our articles and create these like op-ed versions of them precisely for USA Today. In fact, that's where we would publish them. Right. It's interesting that you raised that because we found it got very little traction. Yep. It got very little response. And this issue of going to where people are and their home, there are no small town newspapers anymore. And talk radio is what there is, and there's Fox. And I think the other thing is that Fox, we can have a whole panel discussion about that, but Fox has in a lot of ways replaced those voices. It's supplanted them, and it's done so successfully. It's the genius of Fox, really, is one of the unheralded genius of it, is to replace those voices, make them seem like, oh, this is a person from where I'm from, when of course they're not at all.
Dan Waltz from the Washington Post was asked, I was on a panel with him a couple of months ago, and somebody said, why don't you guys write more policy pieces to inform people? He said, we write them. People won't read them.
Right. Yeah. Okay, more questions. I think we'll take 3 questions. Shall I start there? This gentleman here. Could you tell us who you are?
Hi, my name is Karim Kwanda. I'm a member of Chatham House. So the issue of the decline of credibly independent institutions, perhaps coupled with the rise of unchecked political tribalism, would you say, or to what extent would you say that this is a fault line that's relevant to what we're talking about today?
Right. The gentleman with the red scarf.
Frank Gellier, member of Chatham House. A reference has been made to the concept of deterrence. And I assume nuclear deterrence is part of that. Now, I don't think you can actually discuss nuclear deterrence unless you assume rationality. And the implications of rationality, like self-interest, survival, self-preservation. Now, a few years ago, some so-called experts, on the basis of some theological beliefs held by the president of Iran at the time, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, brought up the notion of a nuclear attack by Iran on Israel. Now, it's quite clear the leaders of Iran are quite irrational. They don't want to be destroyed.
Could you give us a question, please?
And the question is how the experts on irrationality are actually proved wrong by the rational behavior of those who are actually in charge of a country.
Rational behavior. And a third question. The young gentleman there in the second row.
Hi, John Kittle-Palma. I'm a master's student at the London School of Economics. So I think we often think about the rise of sort of unexpert opinions on the internet. That seems to be sort of a focal point. But where I see it most, especially when I go to my parents' house in the States, is on cable news. And it's just unending 24 hours of people who aren't experts. They might be elites in the way some people see them because they're on TV, but they have no expertise. And that's actually had like a much longer runway than the internet. We've had cable news for over 25 years now. So where do you see the role of sort of 24-hour cable news cycles, unending discussions by non-experts about expert topics, and what that does to sort of the electorate?
Who wants to answer? Weak institutions and tribalism. Is this the key fault line of of the times?
I'm not sure I agree with the way it's been put, but I think that the point, which is that the quest for facts and for truth historically has gone hand in hand with institutions that are seen as outside of the fray of politics. This is the whole way back to the scientific revolution of the 17th century, is that the establishment of there being non-political premises for research and for philosophy and for knowledge is key to what then became modern science. And I think that we have a dilemma today, and if the Economic and Social Research Council is watching this, then I should probably watch what I say. But I think there is a dilemma today in terms of whether we want universities to be high impact, fast turnover, engaged, publicly relevant institutions, in which point they become suckered by various sort of trends and 24-hour news channels and social media, and we all have to blog and we all have to be constantly in the thick of things the whole time. And I do quite a lot of that myself. I quite enjoy it. A lot of people don't. Or whether universities are to do the slow, hard, more boring work of seeking truth, which is what they have been historically set up to do. So I think that, in a way, universities are in a bit of a bind now, because I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily encouraging tribalism, but we're all now required to demonstrate impact on the world, and we're measured in the way in which we demonstrate impact on the world, so that when populists come along and say, these people, they're not disinterested, they're not neutral, they've actually got into bed with those people and those people and those people, they've actually got a point to some extent, because there is the requirement, which I understand completely, but I do think that ivory tower has become a pejorative term, and if we're seriously concerned about the status of truth in today's politics, there has to be serious attention to the way in which we fund not only independent journalism, but independent research, where we don't expect constantly keeping up with the news cycle and the political cycle and having policy impact and all that kind of thing. So I'm not sure I quite agree with the way you put it about tribalism, but I do think you're onto something.
I think that question and this question are linked together. Because the availability of information, which we all think of as a great democratizing, leveling, it's actually causing a lot of this tribalism. Because people now have enough, can now separate their streams of information so carefully that they never have to encounter a fact they don't like. And that makes, and that the creation of these echo chambers, the metaphor I use is holding a microphone in front of a speaker until it's ear-splitting. Because in an earlier time, people have asked me, do I think it was better when there were only 3 networks and it was 3 old white guys reading corporate curated news from New York? Okay, we live in a better world. On the other hand, people who had to sit and watch the news every night had to encounter things they didn't want to hear, because you couldn't silo, to use it, you couldn't silo that information. Now, if you want to spend your day watching MSNBC or watching Fox or watching CNN, you only read the Huffington Post or Slate or National Review, you never have to encounter an argument or a fact that you don't like. And that just revs up. I mean, look at this current thing now about the investigation, the Russia investigation. There are 2 completely separate and in some ways equally crazy narratives that have taken off between 2 communities, epistemological communities, that simply never talk to each other. So I actually think they're related problems, because they have to fill that time. There's so much time. They have to put somebody in front of that camera. And if I wonder, one question for experts, how many times have you ever said no to TV? I've said no to producers. Andy Warhol once said, right, never turn down the opportunity to have sex or be on television. I think he did anyway. But I've said to producers, I can't talk about that. I don't know anything about it. And I remember one producer said, come on, it's 5 minutes. I'm like, it would be 5 minutes of nonsense. I don't know this subject. But, you can't blame them. They're trying to fill that time.
Let's have 3 more questions. Sorry.
Okay. A comment, please.
A comment. You said deterrence proves rationality. Deterrence proves rationality. Yeah, do we accept that? The success of deterrence proves rationality?
I think modern deterrence theory is being revised by the understanding that there's a difference between being rational and being reasonable. We no longer, I think, I work on deterrence issues in my other life, and I think that presumption of universal Western-style rationality has been worked on and has been refined. I think we have, going back to Leslie's point, that although it seems commonsensical, real experts spend a lot of time talking about this.
And disagreeing on certain things.
Right.
Sorry, I just want to make one little point
Yep.
to your question too, which is that a lot of what you asked about cable news, and Tom, this gets to what you were saying. A lot of what you're seeing on cable news is actually people who, might, if they were being honest, would say, well, I'm no expert, but I do play one on TV, especially on Fox. I mean, if you can watch Fox, you can get Sebastian Gorka, who can tell you all about Islamic radicalism, even though he's really hardly qualified to do so. You can get Judge Janine Pirro to tell you all about the Russia investigation, and you can get Judge Andrew Napolitano to tell you all about the Justice Department. Now, these are people who, the network that puts them on has cast them in the role of expert, and you had talked about media training. They're very, very good at it. They're really good at it. I mean, I'll watch them, and these are people I disagree with, and I start kind of getting lulled into, oh yeah, that's a good point, and I say, wait on, snap out of it, They're good at it because this kind of communication is a skill that people who are qualified need to learn, that people who are unqualified have realized, I don't really need to understand any of this. All I need to be able to do is talk about it well on TV.
Who's got a quick question? This gentleman here. Anyone else got a quick? Yes. Yes.
Hi,
Who are you?
I'm a term member at the council. It strikes me that there might be some policy choices we can make to improve the quality of expertise and the credibility. So if you contrast the states where I grew up in Singapore, where I lived for a long time, the amount of prestige and the associated pay that goes with traditional positions of expertise, whether it's teaching or government civil service. You grew up in Singapore and the smartest boys and girls in your class went to Harvard and Oxford and then came back and went to find different ministries in Singapore because their tuition was paid for. You immediately say, wow, these are really bright people. And they also aren't compelled because they're paid well to necessarily trade in that job to go make money in the private sector, right? So you don't have that same corridor, like you do in DC to New York. And so that also improves their credibility because you don't feel that they're conflicted, or you don't feel like they're pushing policies on you with an eye towards their next employer. I mean, should we not be thinking fundamentally about what we can do in the West to kind of assign more prestige and pay better and reduce some of those, potential conflicts for people in government, for people in, that go into teaching professions, et cetera?
Okay. Give more prestige to teachers and civil servants.
People who teach, and yes, absolutely, we need a lot more. It's a losing argument, though. You're not going to make I have defended congressmen as I've worked in Congress. I mean, believe it or not, congressmen, yes, they spend a lot of time on the phone trying to raise money. It's ugly, it's dirty business. They also work really hard. They spend a lot of time, especially if they have to travel far. If you tell an American, think of congressmen as the board of directors of the wealthiest, most powerful corporation on earth, and they make $175,000 a year. They are vastly underpaid. Americans, their heads explode. They say, why are all these congressmen corrupt and on the take? And why are they making so much money? It's an argument you can't win. I've tried. I wish you were right. I wish we would think of, the civil service as a noble calling. I wish we would think of, I love that you said the ivory tower is now a pejorative. I'm trying to remember the time when it was like a good thing. But, Americans, and I'm being specific of Americans, the idea that college professors should be highly paid or civil servants, that's just not an argument.
Final question. Would this only work in a small place like Singapore, which is sort of unique in its political system?
And an undemocratic. I don't mean Singapore is undemocratic. I mean in a place where you can override the public's kind of distaste for paying civil servants what they're worth. You're not going to do that in a country of 300 million people as a democratic choice. The last thing we amended our Constitution about was not allowing congressmen to vote a pay raise that, think of this, a 200-plus-year-old written Constitution, and the last amendment we stuck on it was so that congressmen can't take advantage of a pay raise within that electoral cycle, because we thought that was so important, we had to actually ink that onto the Constitution.
Okay. Our time is up. Thank you for your questions, for your interest. Thank you to our panel, Leslie Vinjamuri, Justin Vogt, Tom Nichols, and Will Davies. So will you join me in a round of applause for our panel?